of life.
Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, our region's longest-running public affairs program. Lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota are joining us today for a recap of the week's activities at the state capitol. This is your opportunity to call or email your legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSC News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Well, with about 2 weeks left in the 2018 legislative session, Minnesota lawmakers have a lot of work to do to finish the session on time. Most of the major omnibus bills have been passed now, but they still need to be reconciled with the Senate versions of the bills. An unpredictable and potentially complicated conference committee process will soon begin. Now, this will be our final show of the session and your last opportunity to find out where legislators stand on key issues. You can call the studio with your questions by dialing 218-788-2844 or our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. You can also email questions to askmlr@wdsc.org. When you do call, volunteers will write down those questions and they'll bring them to me here in the studio. Now let's introduce the legislators who are joining me in the WDSC studio, starting with Representative Mary Murphy, a Democrat from Hermantown. Welcome back. Representative Jennifer Schultz, a Democrat from Duluth. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And Representative Mike Sundin, also a Democrat from Esko.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you all here. I guess one of the big bills, although there was a lot that happened this week that was of major consequence, but Representative Schultz, the House passed its tax bill this week. A lot of that is to conform with the federal tax bill. Talk a little bit about what's in the bill and what your thoughts are about the bill.
Well, so far we have three versions. We have the governor's tax bill, the House tax bill, and the Senate tax bill. And all of them remove the federal taxable income as a starting position. So we all go to the adjusted gross federal income. So that helps us lower our income where we start from, and then we start taking the deductions. In the House bill, they've eliminated a lot of the deductions that people have been taking in the past. So people may experience higher taxes. They've lowered the tax rate on the second tax bracket by a small amount, but they've given corporations 2 times the amount of tax breaks as working families and seniors. So that's on top of the 40% tax reduction corporations got in the federal tax bill. Governor Dayton's tax bill does a lot more. It introduces a new tax credit for individuals who are making income of less than $140,000 and joint filers of less than $280,000. It also expands the working family tax credit. So people might see reduced taxes as much as between $115 to $200 a year. So it goes a lot farther to help working families and seniors than the House tax bill. The Senate tax bill reduces tax rates on the lowest tax bracket by a small amount. Also, it reduces the state income tax rate if there's a surplus. There's an automatic reduction, but it also expands the state tax threshold from $3 million to $5 million. So there are a lot of big differences. I think the one that's the most fair is the governor's proposal. So we're going to see how the House and Senate reconcile their tax bills and what they present to Governor Dayton.
Now, Representative Schultz, you serve on the tax committee in the House, and I imagine there's been a lot of debate about this bill in that committee and then, of course, on the House floor. But one thing you mentioned was the AGI, and that's a change, right, from how we've taken state taxes in the past. Maybe just explain a little bit about what the difference is there.
Sure. So if we didn't move from using federal taxable income as our starting point on our state income tax form, people, hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans would see an increase in their taxes if we did that. And if we completely conform to the federal tax bill, they'd see another increase. So we really had to change our state income tax system, and that's when we went to the adjusted gross income, which many other states use as well. So it allows us then to use those deductions below the line and help people reduce their tax liability.
And was that pretty much a bipartisan decision made in the committee?
It was. I knew the governor came out with it first, and I know there might have been some reluctance in the House and the Senate to adopt that, but they did because we just didn't have a lot of surplus to work with to reduce people's tax liability. So I think that it's much more fair than just completely conforming or doing nothing. If we did nothing, people's taxes would be very complicated next year.
And Representative Sundin?
Okay, one interesting proposal that was brought up, I guess it was in the Senate bill, was
if there is a surplus, there'd be an automatic deduction in withholding, I guess. And that seems to be a popular idea, but conversely, if there was a projected deficit, was there any talk about automatic increases in taxes?
No. No automatic increase in taxes, just a reduction, which is really hard when it's based off a forecast. That forecast could be wrong.
Sure.
So you really don't want to base changing your income tax rates off of a November forecast. You really want to wait and see what the February forecast is the following year.
The point I was trying to make posing that question is that, that tax deduction in time of a surplus, that automatic, it makes for good politics, but doesn't make for good policy.
Representative Murphy, what are your thoughts on the tax bill as it was debated on the House floor this week?
Well, I voted yes because there was a couple of local things in it for the communities that I serve. And I thought, well, it's going to change anyway so let it get to the conference committee. And it did receive 90 votes in the House of Representatives. So I think that it's hard to talk about taxes without talking about property taxes too. And when we talk about the income taxes and the conformity with the federal, outside of what the local communities will do with their property taxes, we're giving people the false impression that maybe their taxes are going to go down. And we don't know that because we don't know the full tax picture. And that's why it's harder to be the first bill out like we were today or this week. We were the first bill out, and then the Senate reacted after that. And so we'll come with a compromise between those two bills, but the people still won't know their total tax picture until we're all done and they understand that. And then the local communities, by that time, will have probably announced their rates and if taxes are going to go up or down in the local communities, but they're probably going up.
And I voted no on the tax bill because one, it increases taxes, the House version, on 140,000 people. And two, in the next biennium, we're going to have a deficit given the tax breaks that are going to be automatic on the tax rates. So it's real problematic going forward for our budget.
And Representative Sundin?
I was a yes vote on the tax bill due to some of the projects that I had, or some policies for local interests. But at the end of the day, I don't know when we vote on the final bill where I will be.
And Representative Schultz, now that the Senate, of course, did pass its bill, that means the conference committee will be set up. And from everything I'm reading, it's going to be a very complex negotiation. How often does the governor's point of view come in to that process?
Well, the governor has said maybe 20 times or more that he's not going to call a special session. So they have to put a reasonable tax bill in front of the governor. What I think they're going to do is have one big conference committee on all of the supplemental finance budget bills and then present that to the governor. My guess is that because there's so much policy intertwined with the budget, and there's policies he's already said he would veto, he'll probably veto that first draft of the budget bills, and they'll go back to conference committee and get worked out. But my concern with conference committees is it's not very transparent. A lot of things are done behind closed doors, and the public doesn't have a chance to weigh in.
Now, with Representative Murphy and Representative Sundin voting yes, that means you have a chance to get named to the conference committee. Do you think there's any likelihood that'll happen?
Well, it depends on if there is a separate conference committee for the tax bill, and then another conference committee for the supplemental spending bills. And we don't know that yet. But I suspect the tax bill will be separate, and it will be just the House and the Senate tax bills considered. But I don't expect I would be picked for the tax bill, because if they have any Democrats, it'll be Paul Marquardt.
Okay. Representative Sundin, the House Capital Investment Bill, we commonly call it the bonding bill, was released this week by the Republicans. pretty much Democrats are not happy with it. The governor's not happy with it. What's your reaction to the bill that was released, or the bonding figures that were released this week?
Well, the total bill is poorly constructed. I think the starting point of the one provision here cripples the whole bill when you start bonding for transportation. You know, if you're going to bond over $100 million, that knocks a lot of other projects out of the bill. And I've always been in favor of an increased gas tax for transportation needs, and bonding for transportation just cripples the ability of the legislature to do good work with the bonding bill.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for the gas tax is it puts it on the people that are using the highways. That's your reasoning?
Exactly. It's a dedicated fund to the trunk highway uses. So it's a user tax, and it's very obvious where that money goes.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'll get each of your opinions on the bonding plan at this point, but Representative Schultz, there is money in the bill for Duluth steam plant conversion, so that's a bit of good news at the start.
It's excellent news. So it's close to $7 million. Mm-hmm. We also have money in there for some UMD projects as well.
Mm-hmm. And Representative Murphy, what about for your thoughts and in your district? Any money that's in there for your district?
Yes, there is in the Water Public Facilities Authority was funded to the point that they can fund the Two Harbors water lift project and the Rice Lake water projects. Mm-hmm. And but the $800 million, although that's a huge amount of money, it could be $1.4 billion and cover all our needs in higher education, in K-12 education, in environment, in natural resources, in the state appropriations that are needed for all the state buildings across the state, and the upkeep of those buildings, the roofs, the furnaces, the parking lots, the things that are needed all over the state. And by having it at $8 million instead of $1.4 billion, we're underserving some of the major needs that are necessary and that we thought we would fund and that the governor recommended funding for. Mm-hmm. And so other people are going to have to get done with smaller amounts of money or phase the programs, and then we're not going to be, we're not starting out clean the next bonding bill. But it's, if we have to do it, it covers most of our needs.
Well, Representative Sundin, it seems like the Republican priority with what they released this week is more to fix our current assets, not build a lot of new assets. And the governor, of course, wants about twice as much in bonding. Talk a little bit about the differences there, what the governor wants compared to what the Republicans are paying for.
Well, you're talking about deferred maintenance on a lot of the public facilities, and it is way behind. Even with what they've proposed, we're still going to be way behind on maintenance of public facilities. Jay Cook State Park is an excellent example right there. It's been put off for such a long time. They're finally going to get some of the work done, but it's just embarrassing. You wouldn't take care of your own house that way. So why those of us that are charged with taking care of the state, why aren't we stepping up and taking care of the state facilities the way we should? Sure, as a building trades guy, I certainly do like new buildings and road construction as well, but there again, that separation between should be clear. And if that transportation component wasn't there, we could do more.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. This is your opportunity to call in with questions to the elected leaders who represent you. Just like Michelene did, this call actually came in late last week. We didn't have time to get to it. Michelene from Duluth was wondering, Representative Schultz, how is the legislature planning to handle the abuse and neglect in senior living? She says especially in the for-profit portion. there's been a lot of reports of elder abuse,
Right.
neglect. Is there anything happening in the
Well,
legislature?
this is a priority for Governor Dayton and the DFL party. Unfortunately, it's not a priority for Republicans. So there was a task force put together by the governor, and it had all the stakeholders on it, including organizations like the AARP and people that represent elderly and families who need elder care. And they put together a really strong bill and presented that, and the Republicans took some pieces of it, but not the total piece, which the most important piece was licensure of assisted living facilities and more accountability on assisted living facilities and regulation, and that piece is missing from the Republicans' version in the House. And we're hoping there's a stronger bill going through the Senate on elder care. We're hoping that's the version that gets through conference committee that gets to the governor. So really the biggest piece is licensure, rather than, I think the Republican bill has a whole bunch of task forces to study. We already know of the problem and we know how to solve the problem. We just have to pass the bill and implement it. And Republicans aren't willing to go that far.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on this? Representative Sundin?
Certainly, at the end of the day, what a lot of these care facilities need is a little more money to pay their people, because of the turnover of the help in those facilities is just astronomical. And when you're not paying somebody enough, they sit down at the break table, I'm certain of this, I've seen it done in facilities, and they open up the page for want ads. And if you're at a job and you're looking for another job, there's a problem there. So the work environment has got to be better. The pay environment's got to be a lot better for these people that are in the building, working hand in hand every day with the elderly.
Representative Schultz, the House passed a combined health and human services and transportation omnibus budget bill. Kind of seems like a strange combination. What did you think of that bill?
It was a strange debate on the floor when we were going between health and transportation. The health care bill, it prevented us to explore opening up the Minnesota Care Program for people to buy in at the full premium. There's language in the bill that prevents people from even evaluating that, which is one of the reasons why I voted no. But overall, it just didn't go far enough to provide things like Representative Sundin was talking about, higher reimbursement rates in the MA program, Medicaid program, to reimburse people working in nursing homes and long-term care. It did fix the disability service area. The CMS was going to not implement the 7% increase we gave to those working in disability services, those providers, and we reinstated that in this bill, and we're going to go get that waiver from CMS. So it did correct that, but it really didn't do enough to address all of their health care needs in the state.
And Representative Sundin, you serve on the Transportation Committee in the House. What was in the bill as far as transportation goes? I know you said earlier on this show that there hasn't been a lot going on with transportation this year.
That's right. There, I'll talk about what's not in the bill. You know, there's no additional money directed for law enforcement and public safety on the highways. There was very little to address railroad crossing issues and grade separation, that type of thing. And there's absolutely nothing for the airports in the air industry. And the state of Minnesota owns a couple of airplanes, and one of them's older than I am, and I don't know if it's in as good a shape, but but they're definitely in need of replacement.
Okay. I have a call from Jean in Cook, and she's wondering, why are there never any Republicans on the show? It seems very one-sided. Well, I just want to let Jean know that we do invite all of our area lawmakers on every week, and it just happens that most of the Republicans live a long ways away, so they're not always able to drive here. One of our shows that was snowed out, we were going to have a Republican on that show, but the show got canceled because of snow. Representative Murphy, we talked about this a little bit before the show. There was a real marathon floor session on Thursday. There was a 4-part omnibus supplemental finance bill. It included agriculture, environment and natural resources, job growth and energy affordability, and state government finance bills. Talk a little bit about that debate. I think you said that just about everybody had something to say about that one.
Well, it touched on something that everybody knew something about or was upset about something in the categories. The amendments didn't necessarily come up all together for the topic, and so we were kind of jumping around between the 4 topics during the afternoon and evening, and it took a long time because it's not good to push them all together. And even if they were going to have one conference committee with all those subjects, if we could have discussed each bill separately just by itself, I think we would have been better off. But I'm not running the show, and so I just sat back and listened and endured. And the points that had to be made were made by both sides of the questions, and I don't think anybody voted for those bills with ignorance. In ignorance, we all had the knowledge of what was in the bill and whether it was good or bad, and some of us thought that there was more bad than good and didn't vote yes, but the bill was very successful.
Now, Representative Sundin, two of the committees that were covered in here you serve on: Environment and Natural Resources, Policy and Finance, Job Growth and Energy Affordability, Policy and Finance. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what maybe there are some aspects or what items maybe of interest were in this big four-part bill that passed this week.
The jobs bill, I voted for it in committee in hopes of I guess getting some recognition and getting on a conference committee at some point, but that's not going to happen. In the Environment Committee, you know, the big deal still is the race standards, and we're working on that. We're working on that, and I've voted against the Environment Bill, and I'm ready to switch my vote if we can get $500,000 to study that issue a little bit more and include the tribes in on the solution seeking anyway. But there's also a subcommittee there, mining and tourism.
Right.
And I don't know exactly why they have that subcommittee. We met once and laid a bill over, and it was pretty much an informational meeting, and that was it. It was just pretty much, I guess, just an excuse to give a junior Republican a gavel for a short time. So he feels good about it. It was pretty much a waste of time.
Representative Schultz, any comments about this four-part omnibus bill?
Sure. So the State Gov Finance bill, it cuts agency budgets by 7%. So people who rely on services that the state provides is going to be problematic. It also cuts the Department of Human Rights by 30%. So if you have some human rights violation or concern, that office is going to be struggling. So I voted no. And there are other things in the bills. We had a long discussion. I brought up my redistricting as an amendment, but the Republicans brought up a secondary amendment, so they actually now have more control over drawing the boundaries of the district lines for congressional seats and legislative seats in Minnesota. Democrats voted no on that amendment, and Republicans voted yes. So they really want to retain control, and that really harms our democracy. So it was a really bad vote for the Republicans.
Talk about what your amendment would have done, how you were going to handle redistricting.
Sure. So it would have brought it into an independent commission, 5 retired judges, and then 4 people from the community. So try to make it as nonpartisan or bipartisan as possible, because right now legislators control it, and we're never successful in drawing the lines. It goes to the courts, and it's in jeopardy of really expensive litigation if the parties don't agree. And the next census is in 2020. And if one party controls both the legislative and executive body, we're going to see gerrymandering like we have seen in other states.
All right, well, we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Representative Murphy, this week Governor Dayton called for what he called emergency aid to Minnesota school districts who are struggling with budget shortfalls. Tell us a little bit about that. You mentioned it earlier in the budget bill that there wasn't as much funding for education as you had hoped. Right.
And Governor Dayton has come out and he heard after the education bill did pass that still didn't meet the needs. And especially one of the reasons is early childhood, and the other is early childhood and public education, especially for 4-year-olds, and that there still aren't enough slots for the children that have the needs in the schools that want to participate in the program. the other thing is that the costs to major school districts across the state and many smaller school districts across the state, in what they have to pay for special education costs that have to come out of the general fund of per pupil unit funding, because the federal government doesn't pay their share, and there seems to be increasing needs for children, and we have to fund those programs. It's our moral duty to fund those programs, and so this $123,000, I think it is, or $132, or $1 million. I mean, this additional funding would address that in particular, and not all schools, but the schools that have great needs.
Representative Schultz, what about the Duluth Public Schools? You represent them. That's one area of need, is that correct?
Definitely. They definitely need more funding, and it was $138 million. There are 33 schools identified in Greater Minnesota that would benefit, and 26 schools in the metro area that would benefit. So all of our public schools are struggling with class sizes and having people in the classroom to help the students, and this would go a long way. Even though it's one time, schools are really struggling. We need to find a long-term solution. But I'm not sure. The Republicans are saying it's too late in the session to introduce something like this, but I hope Governor Dayton puts it on the bargaining table and he can get it.
Representative Sundin, what about in your district? Are there some districts that could really use this extra funding?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I find it interesting with a budget surplus right now, why we can't direct some of that money into this. Just a reminder, the state of Minnesota is constitutionally charged with, the legislature is charged with two responsibilities. One is roads for commerce, and the other one is a uniform education system. And we're kind of falling behind on both of those right now. So,
Representative Murphy, is the long-term solution perhaps increasing the per pupil funding numbers, or is that just part of the problem? Is it some districts have more needs for special ed and so on, so it's not always a even playing field from district to district?
No, I think you have to look at what schools have the largest needs for this $138 million, because it's one time. And so we can't put that on per pupil need, because then we would have a hole in the next biennium when we come in, and then it'd say you're cutting education costs. But this would meet the direct needs for the next year and a half.
Okay. What happens if that money isn't there then? These schools just go further into debt, or there must be job losses, or bigger, larger class sizes?
Then the schools can't expand what they are currently doing at all.
All right. Well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. Call in with your questions to the lawmakers who represent you. And I saw Representative Sundin wanted to add something to this.
On the school, the needs of the school districts statewide, I believe it was in 2015 or 2014 possibly, 80% of the referendums in the state of Minnesota for school bond issues passed. People want to invest in their schools, and they realize the importance of this. And I guess that's a good statement to back up the argument that Minnesotans really do prioritize education.
All right, what about higher education, Representative Schultz? We haven't talked too much about that since the last time you were here. What is, if anything's happening with funding for higher education?
Well, they didn't do so well this session. So the University of Minnesota system asked for $10 million to hold tuition flat. They got $500,000 of that $10 million, so it looks like tuition may be going up for some campuses, hopefully not for UMD. And then the Minnesota State system, they did a little bit better. They got $5 million spread across their campuses. So that was just their request. Their bonding request, University of Minnesota received $75 million so far, but they asked for $200 million. And then Minnesota State received about $120 million for bonding money. So it's really, really not good for students. I could see tuition going up. We didn't do anything to address the high level of student debt. So we really didn't, the Republicans didn't do enough for higher ed and for students.
Representative Sundin, this bill passed this week in the House. It increases penalties for protesters who illegally block roads. Now, I don't know if you heard that bill in the Transportation Committee, but wondering what you think of that bill. This goes back to some protests in past years that blocked some freeways in the Twin Cities, caused some traffic hazards. What do you think of that bill?
We heard it on the floor the other night, and it's borderline ridiculous, is what it is. It's an effort to curtail a lot of people's freedom of speech. If people need to protest, they have no other avenue to voice their concerns. They're certainly able to take it to the streets, and I believe there's no protester, nobody out there that wants to endanger anybody else on the freeways or in any public setting. But I think it's out of the 120 some bills that Representative Zerwas has forwarded, this is probably the biggest lemon.
And Representative Murphy, was a lot of debate on this bill on the floor?
A long debate, but and we didn't do a good enough job to explain that current law already addresses every situation that was brought out. And current law, if well enforced, could stop the things that they frequently said was wrong. And so that's why they were able to put those curtailments on. And it'll seem like they're tougher on crime or tougher on individuals that are breaking the law.
Representative Schultz, I think I read that it goes from a misdemeanor to a gross misdemeanor. So I'm not sure. I'm not a legal expert how much of a difference that is.
That's a big difference, and people now may be reluctant to go protest because they will fear being arrested and having a criminal record. So I think it's a problem. I mean, this is one power that people have, and the power to vote and the power to protest. And we've overcome so many challenges in our country because people have had that power to protest and change things. And now Republicans want to criminalize it. It's a problem.
All right, Representative Schultz, you haven't been on the show for a couple of weeks. I wanted to ask you about a bill that would require a work requirement to receive Medicaid, and what's happening with that bill and your thoughts on it.
Well, it went through the committee process. It thankfully didn't get rolled up into one of the supplemental omnibus bills, but it will probably come to the floor for a vote. I'm voting no. I hope all of my colleagues will vote no. It's a bad, bad bill. It basically tries to take away health care from those who desperately need health care. Other states have been introducing it. It would not save much money because a lot of the program is federally funded, our Medicaid program, and it would be a monthly check. It would, just for St. Louis County, it would be $2 million cost, unfunded by the state to implement it. Across the state, it would be around $80 million to implement. So it doesn't save money, actually costs the state money to implement and check whether or not they're working each month and eligible for the Medicaid program. So I hope it doesn't come up. I know that the governor will veto that bill if it gets to his desk.
All right. Anybody else want to comment on that bill?
It's just mean, just outright mean.
I would say it's an attack on probably the most vulnerable people in the state of Minnesota, and there's a perception out there that these people are loafers or ne'er-do-wells and they're on the public dole, but most of these people are really in need of some additional help, and they're quite possibly minimum wage earners, and when we restrict somebody's wages and put them in that position, that's bad enough, and then to double down on this, it's shameful is what it is. We should have a minimum wage for insurance salesmen or insurance companies that they can only make so much.
But most people are working in the Medicaid program, especially in the state of Minnesota. So most people are working. It's the employers don't always offer health insurance at that level, at those minimum wage jobs, and so they need to get on Medicaid.
All right. Representative Murphy, the House passed the Omnibus Legacy Finance Bill, about a little over $140 million in that bill. What are some of the highlights in your mind? We haven't talked about the Legacy Bill for a while.
Well, most of the legacy funding was done last year, and most of the legacy funding this year was in the outdoor heritage because they do have a yearly allocation of appropriations, and there was nothing that didn't go through the outdoor heritage board, and so there's nothing that was really opposed in the outdoor heritage fund or in the clean water fund, and the other fund was the arts and culture fund, and that was the smallest appropriation was from that, and that was just for a couple things that were in the bill last spring, but did not get funded by the conference committee, and one of those was $300,000 for an exhibit for the Duluth Superior Aquarium, or the Great Lakes Aquarium, our aquarium. And the previous money that they had gotten for an exhibit served them very, very well, and brought many more people into the aquarium. And so we think this $300,000 will help them continue expanding their exhibits.
And this bill get pretty much overwhelming bipartisan support, is that true?
In fact, it got everyone's vote, yes. There was no vote no. And so that's very good. Unfortunately, the Senate doesn't have a bill. And so we think it will be conferred with the environment bill from the Senate. But I'm not sure how the Senate's going to bundle their environmental, if they do bundle like we bundled, or if they're going to go separate on their bills. But we'll find that out in the next week and a half.
Right. All right, we've got a bill that passed the House this week that proposed some changes to campaign finance law. All of you, of course, have to campaign. I don't know which one of you might want to talk about it, but what are the changes in the campaign finance law?
Those are mostly technical changes.
Mostly technical changes?
Yes, and
okay.
that came from the Campaign Finance Board, so I don't think it was a big deal. But
Okay.
when we were debating state gov finance, one of our members, Representative Tina Liebling from Rochester, offered an amendment so that you were required to report who paid for your trips as a legislator, and the DFL party voted in favor of that amendment. Unfortunately, Republicans voted that down. So we were trying to get to more transparency in who funds our travel for legislative or non-legislative of travel.
Representative Sundin?
Yeah, the reason Representative Liebling brought that up is in recognition of some of the traveling that the Republicans did last August, I believe it was. And there's some serious questions raised as to who paid for some trips and where they stayed and what they were doing over in London, I guess it was. Yeah, so it was, there's always somebody ready to abuse the system, and I think we saw some of that last summer. And I guess Tina Liebling actually did a pretty good job of spelling that out on the House floor.
All right, well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. This is our final show of the session. If you have any questions for our lawmakers, please call them in now to the numbers on your screen. Representative Schultz, another issue that I'd like to ask you about, developments surrounding the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP benefits. Tell us what's going on with that program.
Well, Republican Representative Kelly Fenton brought forward a bill so that some counties couldn't have a waiver. So right now, under federal law, there's work requirements to be eligible for food assistance. And when that was implemented, 64,000 people in Minnesota lost food assistance help, and we saw huge demand on food shelves to meet the needs. And Representative Fenton wanted to not allow counties to get a waiver, so she wanted to implement that across counties in Minnesota. And the problem with that is there are not jobs in many of our counties in the state of Minnesota. And so that's why they were eligible for the waiver. So another way to hurt people who desperately need to feed themselves and their children. And that bill was not in, luckily, in the Health and Human Services omnibus bill, but it could come back as a separate bill.
Okay. Representative Sundin, you mentioned this in passing, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more because this week the Senate passed its version of the wild rice bill. Basically, the measure calls for starting over on sulfate standards in the state. For folks who haven't watched the show recently, talk a little bit about what that's all about, what's happening with that.
There's acceptable levels of sulfate in effluent waters, I guess, or any waters for wild rice. And there's a policy in place, or I guess standards in place, that 10 parts per million of sulfate in the water is acceptable and nothing more than that. And I think it's kind of an arbitrary standard, and I think it requires more research and more discussion and more people at the table. That standard's based on 1940 vintage science and research, and it was implemented back in 1973 and never enforced. But now with mining issues that are coming up, and people are far more concerned about it, and I believe it needs more attention and more discussion and clear determination of what is safe and what's not. Safe drinking water, this water, if it was 249 parts per million of sulfate, it would be acceptable to drink. 250, not so much, but
It wouldn't taste very good.
yeah. So we have a lot of people that are presumed experts. I'm not one of them, but a lot of people that are railing on one side of the issue or the other about what's right and what's wrong. And I think we need some more research and some more discussion on this. So if there's mining going ahead, we can do it safely and find ways to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. All right, Representative Murphy?
Well, I don't think that we should eliminate a standard until we have another standard to take its place. Mm-hmm. And that's what we did on the floor of the House of Representatives last mm-hmm. week, is we took the standard away, and now there's nothing. Mm-hmm. And supposedly, the PCA will make a new standard, but we don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know anything about it. And they said, well, you weren't, the standard wasn't being carried out or observed anyway, or they weren't enforcing the standards as they are. And because there's too much question, and there should be more science, we should have more science explaining it to it, and we should understand it better. The whole scientific procedure, we should understand better. Well, but I don't think that we should remove a regulation or a standard until there's something, an alternative to go to.
Mm-hmm. All right, Representative
Sure.
Schultz?
So the MPCA came up with a different idea for standards that varied across bodies of water, and 2 administrative law judges ruled that was violation of our Clean Water Act. So that variation is not going to go forward, so we need something else. 1940 science is still good today, and that study's been replicated by many of our professors at the University of Minnesota. And so people are really concerned about when sulfate turns to sulfide and it pollutes the water and it doesn't allow wild rice to grow. So we need to figure that out, because right now our wastewater treatment centers don't meet the standard, even though they're not all of them are discharging into wild rice bodies. We need to keep the standard. I agree with Representative Murphy that we need to keep the standard until we can get something else that protects the wild rice.
Representative Sundin?
If that sulfate standards were enforced at this point, and given the MPCA's opinion on it, this could cost the city, or WSSD, $500 million to come into compliance. And that's pretty much impossible to do statewide. So yeah, we need more discussion, we need more research, we need to find an answer that's affordable so we can move forward.
And when you refer to WLSSD, is that their discharge doesn't
Yeah,
meet
yeah.
that standard right now?
Right.
Okay. Representative Murphy?
This coming week, we're going to have an experiment, though, or we're going to have the opportunity to taste waters of 3 different kinds of waters, or something.
With
to
different
te-
levels of
to
sulfate?
tell if we can tell the difference between good water and bad water. And it's part of the ongoing demonstration to the legislators that maybe we really have to discuss this a lot better than we have been doing in the past. I think it's just an opportunity that we're going to have to face up to.
Well, how does that process work? Are they
I
going
don't know.
to bring in water and
don't
have
know.
everybody try it?
It's Water Action Day, so we've had a lot
got
of
it.
water
Yeah.
days,
Got it.
and this
Yep.
is Water Action Day, or Clean Water Action Day, and I think that we're going to have an opportunity to taste different water from different cleaning
I see.
processes.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything else on that? Phil from Hibbing called. He has a question, Representative Murphy. What is the status of the bill that would put the national model or the motto "In God We Trust" in every school building? Have you heard about that one?
No.
Representative Schultz, have you?
I think that it may have been one of the bills that I probably voted no for, but it allows schools to put that on their building. It doesn't mandate it, but it gives them the choice.
And right now, that's not. Is that a separation of church and
It
state
is,
thing?
yes.
Okay. Right now, it's not allowed. Representative Schultz, you mentioned this briefly at the beginning of the show, but the penny a pill for opioid abuse is not in the current health bill.
Correct.
Talk a little bit about that money, how that would be used, and why you think it's so necessary.
Well, it is necessary because we have a problem with opioid addiction and heroin, and we don't have enough treatment facilities or the beds for those individuals who desperately need to get into treatment. So we would like the pharmaceutical companies to pay for it because they've invested a lot of money pushing these drugs out to providers and providers prescribing them. So we're doing a good job, prescribers holding back and not prescribing as many and getting them out of people's medicine cabinets. But the penny per pill would provide $20 million of revenue to help address treatment and prevention. And right now that language was removed on the House side by Representative Dave Baker. That will come to us as a standalone bill. They want to use general fund money, which competes with everything else we need general fund money for, like education and roads. And on the Senate side, they've put in a licensing fee instead of a penny per pill. It generates just as much revenue, $20 million. It's much better than taking it from the general fund. So hopefully the Senate will save the day, and we'll get that bill into conference committee, and we can get a separate dedicated revenue source that the pharmaceutical companies pay that can address opioid crisis.
Can you explain how the licensing fee would work?
So it's very similar, but it's
Okay.
called, instead of, Republicans hate the word tax or fee, so it's a license, so that they believe the tax is always automatically passed on to consumers, which isn't always true. But I think it's just it's a different way to message it for the Republicans.
Representative Murphy?
I think it's interesting. I think that the licensing fee or the license costs, the cost of the license, I think it's interesting that word is being brought to us by the same people that brought us the fee. The Plenty brought us the fee thing instead of a
Right.
tax.
Right.
So we went from tax to fee, and now we're going to fee and license.
It's still all
So
green, right?
It's still the same thing, and if it raises $20 million from the drug companies so that it shows that they also are partly responsible for the opioid addictions that are taking place, they're at least paying something for the cost of finding solutions.
Representative Sundin?
Well, I haven't seen any pharmaceutical companies in bankruptcy court lately. The money is there. They're profiting greatly from the opioids, and I think it behooves us to press hard on this issue.
Representative Schultz, I know Governor Dayton has made a lot of announcements during this session about the opioid abuse problem. Can you talk a little bit about, if this money is allocated, what are some of the plans for use and how that would help, bring this problem under control?
Well, right now, our people in public safety, our first responders, don't have Narcan kits. And the price is going up. So the immediate need is to supply these kits so people can be saved from an overdose. That's the immediate need, and a lot of the money will go towards that. And the rest will go towards treating and education and prevention. So there's a little bit of money right now in some of the bills, in the HHS bill, to go educate young people in the schools about the dangers of opioids and other drugs. And we're going to see a lot more, hopefully, treatment beds opening up and dealing with getting people healthy. And it's really hard to come away from that addiction, but getting them treatment so they can address their disease.
And is there an educational message in it too? Because a lot of people, you know, they have a surgery or something, but they have some leftover pills, and rather than disposing of them, they leave them in their medicine cabinet, and oftentimes that's what leads to somebody taking a pill that wasn't for them.
In the HHS bill, there's these kits that you can put the drug in some liquid, and it dissolves the drug and it makes it non-effective. And so those kits will be available as well, so people can self-dispose, and then there'll be education about where they can drop them off if they want to get rid of them, but also educating providers and dentists not to prescribe as much or not to prescribe as many days supply, so really reducing the days supply.
Representative Sundin?
I think proper disposal of those medicines is actually very critical. They're finding ibuprofen levels in fish now, so.
Right, right. Just flushing them down the toilet doesn't work because our systems can't get that out of there, even when they go through
The biggest contaminant in Lake Superior are medications.
So I've dealt with recycling bills before, and they should always go back to the point of origin. So if you bought it from Walgreens, if you have excess medications, it should go back to Walgreens, and they can dispose of it properly.
And didn't the legislature a number of years ago mandate that when you change your oil, you bring your oil back to the place that you bought the oil, and they dispose of it properly? So it could be a similar type of thing, I suppose. Representative Sundin, speaking of oil, wasn't meaning to do that kind of transition, but it worked out. Gas prices are on the rise this spring. Legislature ever look at pricing practices or have any kind of control over that? I'm sure you hear from your constituents every year when gas prices go up. Why are the prices going up? What can you do about it?
Buy an oil company and just straighten out the whole industry. No, I was thinking about this on the way down, because of my rants about the gas taxes. In the last couple of weeks, there's a 20-cent jump in the price per gallon that I noticed, and I didn't see any road improvements coming with that. So I guess that'd be my take on that.
Right.
As far as saving money on gas, drive a little less if you want, carpool.
Well, we had electric vehicles showcased at the Capitol
Right.
this week, and so I think you'll see more and more people, if they can afford it, buying all electric vehicles as more and more of those come on the market.
And it
Hopefully
seems-
the price will come down.
And the technology seems to be getting better and better as far as electric cars go. So, but it has to reach a tipping point, I guess, when people start to decide on that. Representative Murphy?
But then last week I heard that Ford isn't going to be making so many models of cars anymore because people are they're making much more profit off of their trucks and their SUV kind of vehicles. And so us poor old ladies that need a sedan are going to be left out evidently, or we're going to have to buy a sporty Mustang maybe, but
They get pretty good
and
mileage.
I can look good in a Mustang, I'm sure, but the choices aren't going to be there out of the ordinary family car type of thing versus the SUVs and the trucks. But they use more gas than
Right.
the little old sedans.
Right.
And so it just doesn't make sense.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to wrap up just by asking each of you a little bit about what you see happening these final 2 weeks of the session. Representative Sundin, there's a lot of complicated negotiation that has to happen in the conference committees. Do you think things will wrap up on time? The governor says no special session this year, so it pretty much has to, right?
I certainly hope that the Republican leadership in both the Senate and the House take the governor seriously. I know we're getting saber rattling from chairs in the House that this is going to be the only bill. This is it. If you don't like this bill, you're going to be stuck with nothing. So everybody's trying to posture themselves for negotiations here, but I hope they take the governor seriously.
And Representative Schultz, what are your thoughts on the last 2 weeks here?
Well, we end May 21st, but the last day is ceremonial, so we have about 14 days left. We're getting really close to the deadline. I'm concerned that if we won't have enough time for the governor to veto and then come back and put together stronger bills that he'll sign. So I think Republicans need to act pretty quickly.
And Representative Murphy, do you see an orderly end to the session this year? You're our prognosticator.
I do see an orderly end to the session because there's an election coming up in November, and everybody's going to be in 15 days on the campaign trail. And I think that the Republicans want very much to have an orderly end, and they have a plan. And they're going to try, if the plan has obstructions, they'll blame the Democrats. And I don't think we're going to be able to talk any bill down. I think all the bills will pass that have to pass. And whether they come back from conference committee in a form that can be acceptable or not, for most of the bills, the Republicans have the votes. And so I think we will finish on time, and it will be orderly.
All right, well, I wish all of you good luck, and I want to thank each of you, Representative Murphy, Representative Schultz, Representative Sundin, for being here today. Good luck those final 2 weeks. Thanks again to the lawmakers who joined us today and throughout the session, and to our viewers who called in or emailed their questions this year. And thank you for tuning in for the final edition of Minnesota Legislative Report for the 2018 session. For the crew here at WDSC, WRPT, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.